not rocket science. Asia has been through that cycle, so we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We know exactly what needs to happen to drive development in Africa.
Wale Shonibare, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. A real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Lanre. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, before we get stuck into the topic of conversation, we're going to be talking about Africa's energy potential, how to unlock it, what's holding it back. We're going to talk a bit about financing. We're going to talk about the just transition. But before we get stuck in, give us a little bit of background on yourself, your work, your focus areas, what you do with the bank, and that sort of thing.
Okay, I am Wale Shonibare, Director, Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulation. So basically, my mandate is to see how we can get more private sector investment into the energy sector across Africa. I have two divisions in my department. One is working upstream at policy, regulation, knowledge, statistics to create the enabling environment for private sector investment to come into the energy sector across the value chain. And then the other division is where my financial solutions team, we have a team of investment officers, and we structure across the bank's instruments to facilitate private sector investment. So that includes equity, debt, guarantees, capital market solutions to support investment into the energy sector.
Excellent. Thank you. Very important work, and I suspect quite stressful work, quite busy work.
Yes, there's never enough money to go around, and so it's extremely busy. It also involves helping government unbundle their energy sector, so it involves privatization or unbundling, so to speak, vertically integrated utilities, etc. And that plays well to my background, which is more in investment banking and consulting over the past 30 years.
Okay, excellent. So you've already touched on one of the big issues when it comes to energy in Africa, power in Africa, which is there's never enough money, and we know that there is a very dire need for more financing. If you go online and you research this, you'll come across a persistent theme, which is there's a big financing gap. And I've seen figures ranging anywhere from between the mid-20s to up to $50 billion a year that African economies are falling short. So first and foremost, can you give us a bit of an insight and a bit of a sense of why is it that there's such a persistent financing gap? What's holding back the funding for energy? Because we know Africa's energy potential is immense, be it renewables, be it fossil fuels. Like, what are the missing pieces here?
Yeah. Well, Africa in general has found it difficult to invest in infrastructure to support its development. And that's linked to a lot of factors. First of all, there are many countries in Africa, and the continent is not necessarily acting as a whole. What I mean by that is you have, I think of any continent, the highest number of borders. There are 54 countries. Some of them are tiny, and as a result of that, there are too many currencies. These countries are not exporting a lot. They don't have significant external reserves, and Africa is not saving enough, because typically countries invest in their infrastructure and development through savings. The situation, the very odd situation we have in many African countries is that they are relying on foreign savings to develop their infrastructure. That means borrowing in hard currency. So you have significant foreign exchange risks. And everybody, all the investors bring in the hard currency, are all asking for government guarantees. Well, there's a limit to the amount of guarantees that countries can provide. When it comes to infrastructure, you find that these services are being paid for in local currency, and then you're borrowing long-term in hard currency. There's obviously a currency mismatch, and the financing is not sustainable. It's not sustainable finance. So what we get into is situations where you have devaluations, and the effect of that devaluation cannot easily be passed on to the end consumer, because these are very essential services, and there are political implications. Whenever you increase tariffs for things like electricity and water, there's huge political ramifications as a result. So politicians find it very difficult to do that, and as a result of that, it's the utilities tend not to be sustainably run, and there are significant arrears. So it takes a lot to structure projects in Africa. There are some economies like South Africa where they're able to finance in their local currency, and you see higher deal volumes as a result. So that's one aspect of why it's difficult, because we're not mobilizing sufficient local savings, and which means then we have to go and look for investment from outside, which carries its own its own implications. That's part of it, but we can expand as as we progress.
I was just going to
Yeah.
quickly comment, and of course
Yeah.
we also now have a situation in which a lot of African governments are going through a bit of a funding squeeze. On the back of the COVID pandemic, on the back of devaluating currencies, as you've already hinted at, which I imagine only adds more pressure. But please, I didn't mean to cut you off. So that's one aspect. What else is holding it back?
And also in the energy sector, there's a value chain, and you have to address each aspect of that value chain. So, for instance, there's a diverse energy mix across the continent. In East Africa, many of the countries are largely renewable because you have geothermal energy. You also have significant hydro in countries like Ethiopia, geothermal in Kenya, for instance. But when you go to West Africa, there's a significant reliance on fossil because of the gas endowment in West Africa. They also have hydro to a significant extent. You go to Southern Africa, South Africa is largely coal-based. And then, in all of these countries, it's not just about investing in generation. You have to invest in generation, you have to invest in transmission, you have to invest in distribution. Many countries have stranded generation, which they're not able to evacuate. So, and that affects the bankability of the sector. So you need to address the sector in a holistic manner, because ultimately you have to be able to collect enough to pay for the investment that goes into the sector. So in West Africa, you have a situation where you have gas-based thermal electricity. In some countries, the gas is being paid for in hard currency, and there isn't enough gas. So you have power plants sitting there where there isn't sufficient feedstock for the gas to go into the generation. And then once you get into distribution, there are collection and technical losses, which means you're not collecting enough money to pay all the upstream guys. For that reason, we do a lot of work with governments to look at how the sector can have sufficient liquidity in order to be able to make it sustainable. But we do know that in many instances, even in more advanced countries, you need to subsidize electricity for certain customer groups. So you also have to look at those customer groups that require some level of subsidy, or geographic regions that require some level of subsidy. But that shouldn't create a distortion. So it's quite a complex sector, and that's why it doesn't always work in many countries. But we've seen good examples as well of countries that have reformed their sector and are able to run sustainable utilities. Uganda is a good example where the regulation works, the tariffs are pretty much cost reflective, and the investment is going in. to Uganda. Cote d'Ivoire is also another example. So those are some of the issues.
Look, that's I think that's an excellent excellently ties into the next point I wanted to get your thoughts on, which is, well, from a policy standpoint, because from what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that one of the key elements here is what you do in terms of regulation and policy. And you've just named two countries. This is a very complex and technical sector, but could you maybe just give us a sense of, well, what's working in Uganda? Why is it working in a place like Uganda, a place like Cote d'Ivoire? And what does that tell us about the sort of the essence of the right kinds of policies that are needed to tackle some of these key issues?
Yeah. So if you take a place like Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, there is what you call a cash flow waterfall, which kind of prescribes who should get paid from the money that is collected, which means that the various players have, they get paid for what they're providing. So whoever is providing the gas gets a percentage, then the generation company gets a certain percentage, and the distribution. So you have to, the cash has to cascade through the value chain. And also the regulation should take account of, the change in economics, and you should be able to revise the tariffs to take account of what's happening. If there's increase in inflation or exchange rate, which needs to translate into the consumer tariff. It isn't always popular, but it needs to be done in order for the sectors to be sustainable. Also, one of the things that we're working on is regional interconnections, because it's very important that countries that have excess capacity are able to trade it into countries with deficits. So, for instance, you tend to find that the lower income countries end up paying more for their electricity. So if you look at the countries that are landlocked in the Sahel, like Niger, Burkina, etc., they're largely dependent on diesel, which is quite expensive. So they can, instead of that, they find it easier to buy cheap gas from Cote d'Ivoire. Cheaper electricity from Cote d'Ivoire through bilateral arrangements, and that, in a way, is optimizing the energy mix to make sure that they get least cost electricity. So those situations are what we want to encourage. So we take advantage of the system. Mozambique, for instance, is the largest exporter into Southern Africa power pool because it has, cheap hydro and green hydro resources from the Cahora Bassa, dam. Ethiopia is also investing in order to be able to supply the Eastern Africa power pool. With Uganda, there's been many years of reform. The regulator is the utility is run by the private sector, Umame. They're very efficient. And also, the regulator has been able to create an environment that supports, IPP investment into, the power sector. So it's a combination of all of those things where there's sanctity of contract, and that creates investor confidence to be able to come in and support the sector.
And in terms of bringing in investors and private capital, which is one of your focus areas, presumably that's something that a lot of African countries are going to have to depend on. Where does that private capital come from? Are we thinking here mostly international capital, domestic capital? What does that picture look like?
Ultimately, my view is that no country has ever been developed by the savings of others. So we have to mobilize African savings to develop Africa. You will always have pilot projects and examples, from with foreign investment. But to really move the needle, we have to be able to develop at a continental scale. And that's where the Continental Master Plan comes in, where the African Union, where the regional power pools come in, because you're able to mobilize at scale. If you look at a project like the Inga Dam, huge potential, 40 to 50,000 megawatts, can supply, most of Africa. But where are the transmission lines? Where are the interconnections? Where are the utilities that will make that kind of investment bankable? And where is the industrialization? Because again, you have to, most countries, developed countries, prioritize power to industry because it's the industry that creates the jobs. And it's those jobs that increase your GDP and create the opportunity to build up the external reserves that will support investment. So we don't have sufficient industrialization. We need to have that because you're going to advance, you're going to be able to build your large power plants on the back of industrialized economies. If you're building power plants just for retail, you find that a lot of people can't even afford connection charges, which means government has to subsidize it. So it's very important as you're driving the energy access, agenda. You're also driving the industrialization agenda because we want our countries to become middle-income countries, and that's really what's going to support development. There are several donors who are working across the continent, which is all good. We welcome the investment from donors. But if we're talking about massive investment on the scale that we need, it really has to come from economic development. And it's not rocket science. Asia has been through that cycle, so we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We know exactly what needs to happen to drive development in Africa.
Look, I'm glad you said that, and I couldn't agree more with with your perspective on this and your sentiment on this. But it raises the obvious question: why has it not happened yet? And are we heading to a place where are we heading in the right direction?
Yeah. Finally, I think our leaders are waking up and they are appreciating the potential for continental scale initiatives. I think before the countries have been focused too much on the old, maybe colonial relationships, trading with Europe rather than trading amongst themselves. And I think things like the AfCFTA are hugely important because you have to drive interregional trade. And also things like the regional power pools. What Southern Africa power pool is the most developed because you actually have proper trading, and that's working reasonably well. There's still more to do, but now the West African power pool, all of the interconnections are in place to link 14 out of the 15 countries. The only country that isn't linked into WAP is Cabo Verde because it's an island. But that's a huge development because with all the countries linked, then you can start to have the regional trade, which is also important. And the fact is that the scale that you require for many of these projects, people go to the Sahel and say, look, there's so much sun. Why don't we put solar everywhere? But you have to integrate that intermittent renewable into the grid. So you need a stable grid. Where's the base load? I'm trying to do a solar plant in Chad, for instance. But despite the amount of sun there is in Chad, the grid, the amount of grid capacity is very limited, just over 100 megawatts. So how much solar can you put? If you use a rule of thumb of maybe 20%, you'll find you'd be talking 20, 30 megawatts. If you want to do that on a small grid, then you'll have to go and get batteries. Now, batteries are still fairly expensive. So although you have the renewable potential, many people who talk about the fact that all renewables are much cheaper now, they don't take into account the system costs and the integration costs. The ancillary services. What happens when there is no sun or when the wind stops blowing? Unless you have certain reserves, you're going to destabilize your grid. So everything has to be holistic. And some of these solutions that may work easily in more advanced countries because you have your regional interconnections and there's regional trade. The UK can say very, truthfully that, okay, reliance on fossils is going down, but they can buy nuclear energy from France when the wind stops blowing. Whereas in Kenya with Lake Turkana, where we finance the largest wind farm, it's not necessarily the same because Kenya isn't fully interconnected into the Eastern Africa power pool because that infrastructure is still being built. So when the wind stops blowing in Kenya, then it destabilizes the grid unless you have your reserve. So these are the things people need to understand. It's not that obvious or easy.
I want to get back to the point you made that ultimately, for Africa to really harness its energy potential, Africa has to take ownership of this process. And that to me, it touches on another important topic, which is the issue of a just transition. Yeah. We know that in certain parts of the world, there is a real and growing impetus to get out of fossil fuels. At the same time, you have many African countries, of course, it depends on what part of the continent you're looking at, that are still, reliant on fossil fuels. And at the same time, we're seeing more and more discoveries of natural gas, discoveries of oil that are coming on stream. Countries like Namibia are set to become quite significant energy hubs. At the same time, there is appetite for and a need to transition and harness more renewable energy. What is this just transition debate all about? And what's your take on the need for a just transition, and what does it mean? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I've always said, first of all, that some of the terminology that we use do not necessarily always apply to Africa in the same way as some of the developed. Africa, where you don't have energy access, where you have close to 600 million Africans without electricity. What are you transitioning from? You're transitioning from something you don't have. I mean, so for me, I think, when Bill Clinton said when he was campaigning, it's the economy is stupid, right? For Africa, it's energy access. People have to have electricity. Having said that, we understand that the world needs to transition. The globe needs to transition. But I think everybody except that Africa also needs to develop. And there's a transition timeline, so even if you look at the Paris Agreement, it talks about separate but differentiated responsibility, right? Which means that you have the developed world who are doing the most polluting. Africa has contributed less than 3% to global emissions. Those guys need to get to net zero by 2050, right? The developing world still have more time. We're talking about getting there towards the end of the century. China has said they'll get to net zero by 2060. Some African countries like Nigeria have also said they'll try and hit it by 2060. But in the nationally determined contributions, which is what the countries have signed up to under the Paris Agreement, they have plotted their trajectory to net zero. And people shouldn't assume that everybody is going to peak at the same time. So when it comes to things like gas, I think there's an understanding that gas has a role to play as a transition fuel. in the world's energy transition, and we have to be realistic about it. We're not going to stop everything, now. South Africa, there's a recognition that they have to move away from coal. But even moving away from coal may not necessarily mean moving directly from coal straight into renewables. They may have to move from coal. Within South Africa's energy transition plan, there's a recognition of the need for some gas as well. But you have to move into less polluting fuels. If you look at the most successful example of coal to gas switching, it's happened in the United States as a result of shale gas. They've been able to reduce the emissions by over 30% in a space of 10 years. So let's focus on reducing emissions, yeah? And we have to look at the energy mix and what the natural endowments are of countries, because we're not gonna, this idea of leapfrogging sounds good on paper, but you have to look at the context that the countries are in. And in countries like South Africa, you talk about just energy transition because there are entire communities that depend on the coal industry. So what jobs are these people going to have? You can transition them, but you have to look at the social consequences of that transition. And all of these things have to be considered at the same time so that nobody is left behind. So it's a very complex issue.
Look, I mean, what you're describing is, a sort of pragmatism that's needed in this transition, and an understanding that, the context differs depending on where you go in the world. I mean, in a way, it kind of underlines the point you made earlier that, we can't just sit here and rely on international financing, because there are certain parts of the world, if you go there today and you say we have, a gas prospect here or an oil prospect here, they'll tell you, sorry, we don't do that. When confronted with that kind of, like, we're not interested, what do you do as an African country? Where do you go?
Yeah, where do you go? Well, I think that to a certain extent, you have to rely on countries or institutions that are still able to support that development, first of all, and also relying on individual resources. African countries have to pull together. I think there's no two ways of saying it, and you have to look at ways of being able to also finance in your local currency, so you mobilize local savings. It's not an easy question to answer, but that's where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, hence it's a process, not an event. I mean, what do you make of initiatives like the Africa Energy Bank? This is it's an initiative between Afreximbank, I think, and the African Petroleum Producers Organization, which specifically says, look, we need to have a mechanism by which we can finance oil and gas project or fossil fuel projects.
I think it's an interesting concept, and any idea that mobilizes Africans or Africa resources is to be welcome. And because at the end of the day, we have to do it for ourselves. We can't wait for the rest of the world to do it for us. There should be more financial institutions in Africa. There should be more resource mobilizations and pooling of local savings and resources, how African countries deploy their external reserves. There's too much capital flight on the continent. Money is ended up in foreign countries that should be put to work in Africa. So as this awareness grows and Africa begins to mobilize more of its own resources, these resources have to be deployed to support Africa's development. So, Larry, I hope we will be able to round up soon, because
I was just about to say we've hit our time limit. I was just going to say a good note to end on. Wale, thanks so much for taking the time out. I can see the pressure is on. There's a lot of work to be done, and all I can say is keep up the good work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. All right. Take care. Okay. Bye.